Who is the entity? From dead by daylight in the space between heartbeats, in the silence that falls when a scream dies away, in the darkness that gathers at the edges of the known world, there dwells something beyond ordinary comprehension. It has watched civilizations rise and fall across countless realities. It has fed upon the terror of billions, and it waits still, patient as stone, hungry as the void itself. This is a record of what is known about this ancient horror, drawn from the journals of those who have witnessed its power and somehow survived long enough to document their observations. The tale begins, as all tales of the entity must begin, with an acknowledgement of ignorance. We do not fully understand what we are discussing. We can only gather fragments and hope they illuminate enough to matter. There exists something in the dark spaces between worlds, something older than memory and more patient than stone. It has no true name that mortal tongues can speak, though those who have glimpsed its nature and survived long enough to record their thoughts have given it one: the entity. This is the word chosen by a man named Benedict Baker, a researcher who deliberately sought out this cosmic horror and found himself trapped within its realm for his efforts. He called it evil in its purest form, and in the years since his journals first circulated among the desperate souls imprisoned alongside him, no one has offered a better description. Benedict was peculiar among survivors in that he actively searched for the entity's realm, wanting to find out how to enter it and understand how it worked. He eventually succeeded in his goal and found himself ensnared in the endless cycle of trials like all the others he had read about. He has met the other survivors. He has encountered the killers. And through it all, he has maintained a journal detailing his observations with the rigor of a scientist, documenting an unexplored phenomenon. His entries remain one of the primary sources of information about the entity's nature, though even his extensive observations leave countless questions unanswered. The entity defies easy comprehension. It is not merely a creature lurking in some distant corner of the universe, waiting to be discovered or destroyed. It is something far more fundamental, far more terrible. According to one who calls himself the Observer, a figure imprisoned within a tower somewhere in the entity's vast domain, this being is one of the original ones, an ancient, that existed before the worlds it now consumes were even born. The Observer witnessed what happened when the entity descended upon his own world, watched as it turned reality inside out with its very presence, and he has spent what feels like eternity trying to understand what he beheld. His conclusions are fragmentary, his certainties few, but what he has recorded paints a picture of something that operates on a scale almost impossible for human minds to grasp. The Observer's unique position within the entity's realm gives him access to perspectives that few others possess. He can probe the fog with his device called the Aris, discovering memories and stories hidden within the darkness that surrounds the trial grounds. Through these observations, he has accumulated knowledge that would otherwise remain forever hidden, piecing together a picture of the entity that, while incomplete, represents perhaps the most comprehensive understanding any trapped soul has achieved. The Observer describes the entity's nature in detail across multiple entries, in what are called the Arcus logs, numbered observations that form the backbone of much of our understanding. In Arcus 07, he describes how the entity is the cosmic embodiment of evil, turning worlds inside out with its very presence. This behavior, he notes, was something he and his people witnessed when the entity befell their home world. They watched helplessly as everything they knew was consumed, as their reality was subsumed into the entity's ever-expanding domain. The Observer's survival appears to have been an accident, or perhaps a deliberate choice by the entity, which found use for someone who could record and remember what transpired across its realm. His imprisonment within a tower places him beyond the reach of the trials while keeping him within the entity's domain, a compromise that benefits both parties in different ways. The tower was occupied by others before him, and their journals and observations have added to his understanding of the cosmic horror that holds them all captive. The entity is not simply a predator in the conventional sense of the word. It is a living dimension, a cosmic construct that contains within itself hundreds upon hundreds of pocket realms, each one a prison designed for a specific purpose. When we speak of the entity, we speak of something that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. A presence that manifests in countless forms while remaining fundamentally unknowable. Those who find themselves trapped within its domain catch only glimpses of its true nature, fragments that suggest something vast lurking just beyond perception. The observer exists in one of these countless subrealms, a tower far removed from the reaches of the entity itself, or at least from the action occurs. His isolation suggests that even within the entity's domain, there exist spaces that fall outside its immediate attention. Pockets where those with knowledge and cunning might carve out a form of existence that approaches freedom without ever achieving it. The structure of the entity's realm implies a kind of cosmic architecture, a deliberate design that serves purposes we can only partially discern. The most common manifestations of the entity appear during what are called trials, the ritualized hunts that form the core of its feeding mechanism. Spider-like legs descend from impossible heights, wrapping around those who have been impaled upon hooks, dragging them upward into a darkness that offers no release. Black thorns erupt from the ground to block windows and doors, to shatter wooden pallets, to claim those who fail to escape before time runs out. These appendages seem almost organic, though whether they represent the entity's true form or merely convenient extensions of its will remains unclear. The spikes are used to block exit gates and windows, to destroy the wooden pallets survivors use to impede pursuit, demonstrating the entity's ability to physically interact with its realm in ways that shape the course of each trial. The spider legs serve a more intimate purpose, either shooting through the ground to pierce and kill any survivor who did not escape the trial grounds within the allotted time, or manifesting around hooks to sacrifice hooked survivors, and, in successful sacrifices, appearing above the hook to transport the claimed soul upward into the sky to extract sustenance from the offering. These manifestations represent the entity's most direct intrusions into the proceedings of the trials, moments when the cosmic horror behind the game makes itself visible to those who participate. Some who have studied the matter believe the entity may be plant-like in nature, a hypothesis supported by the phenomenon known as the Blight, a periodic weakening that causes cankerous growths and strange flowers to appear throughout its realm. If this is true, then the entity represents a form of life utterly alien to anything found in the worlds it harvests. A cosmic organism that feeds not on matter, but on something far more abstract. The blight is a symptom commonly found in plants affected by pathogenic organisms, which gives credence to this theory when applied to the entity's periodic vulnerability. During these periods, cankerous growths appear on hooks and pustules manifest throughout the realms in ways that suggest the entity experiences illness or seasonal weakness, similar to vegetative life forms. This vulnerability has proven crucial to the few individuals who have managed to resist or partially escape the entity's control, including Vigo, whose research into the pustule of flowers that bloom during the blight may have allowed him to achieve what no one else has accomplished. The plant-like hypothesis offers a framework for understanding certain aspects of the entity's behavior while leaving many questions unanswered, particularly regarding how such an organism could have achieved consciousness and developed the elaborate system of emotional harvesting that characterizes its realm. The entity is impossibly old. There is no record of when it first came into being, but it is believed to be an ancient creature that travels through space in search of one thing that drives its entire existence: sustenance. The entity is completely driven by an insatiable hunger that is unlike any living organism documented in any world it has touched. Instead of consuming organic matter as creatures of flesh and blood do, the entity's palate is far more particular, far more terrible. It feeds upon emotion, drawing nourishment from the most intense feelings that conscious beings can experience. Benedict Baker, in his endless observations, came to believe that the entity sustains itself on emotion, not simple feelings, but the most intense expressions of the human experience: hope and despair, rage and terror, even affection, between those who suffer together. The developers of Dead by Daylight have confirmed this interpretation, describing their creation as an emotion vampire that requires a constant diet of psychological extremity to maintain its power. This designation captures something essential about the entity's nature: the way it has structured its entire realm around the production and harvesting of strong feelings, creating an elaborate machine for the generation of suffering that operates without rest across countless iterations of its terrible game. This hunger drives everything the entity does, every realm it constructs, every killer it corrupts, every survivor it traps serves a single purpose: to generate the emotional sustenance the entity requires. The trials are not random acts of cruelty, but carefully engineered scenarios designed to maximize the production of intense feeling. Survivors are given hope in the form of generators to repair and exit gates to open, because hope makes despair that much sweeter when it arrives. Killers are empowered with supernatural abilities and driven by rage, because their fury feeds the entity just as surely as the terror of their victims. This is the fundamental truth of the entity's existence. It has constructed an elaborate machine for the production of suffering, and everyone trapped within its realm is merely a component of that machine. The entity feeds on strong emotions of any kind: killer rage, desperation, hope, and even affection between survivors who form bonds during their shared ordeal. Killers and survivors feed the entity equally, their experiences forming two complementary streams of nourishment that sustain its cosmic existence. The blood points that participants in the trials accumulate represent, in some sense, the energy being fed to the entity through their actions, a measure of how effectively they are serving its purposes regardless of whether they hunt or are hunted. The physical appearance of the entity, to the extent that such a being can be said to have one, has never been fully revealed. What survivors see during their moments of sacrifice suggests something vast and dark, a swirling void from which spider-like claws emerge to claim the dying. Some have reported glimpses of yellow, cat-like eyes watching from the depths of the fog, though whether these represent the entity's actual gaze or merely another manifestation remains unknown. These sightings occur at the edges of perception, in moments when attention is elsewhere, suggesting that the entity either cannot or chooses not to fully reveal itself to those within its realm. The observer has offered several descriptions in his attempts to convey the entity's nature, calling it a cosmic blood pudding in one entry and a serpent of chaos in another. Neither term fully captures what the entity is, but both suggest something formless and hungry, something that defies the categories by which we normally understand existence. The comparison to Stephen King's It has been noted by observers familiar with both works of horror, and indeed, there are similarities in how both entities defy easy categorization while manifesting in forms designed to provoke fear. However, the entity of Dead by Daylight appears to be something even more fundamental. Not a single monster hiding beneath a town, but an entire dimension devoted to the production of terror. A cosmic construct that dwarfs any individual creature in scope and power. What we do know is that the entity operates across multiple dimensions, pulling victims from countless worlds that exist parallel to one another. The survivors and killers who populate its realm come from different times and different realities, drawn together by forces they cannot comprehend. The Huntress was taken from the forests of World War I era Russia. The plague hailed from Babylonian times thousands of years ago. Survivors have been drawn from what we would consider the modern era, from periods yet to come, from realities that differ significantly from our own. The entity appears drawn to darker worlds, places filled with chaos and violence, though whether this represents preference or necessity remains unclear. Some scholars of the lore have suggested that the entity can only gain a foothold in worlds whose inhabitants have failed to understand the metaphysical relationship between their thoughts and their reality. That ignorance of certain cosmic truths makes a world vulnerable to its influence. This would explain why the entity corrupts before it consumes, why it nudges individuals toward violence and atrocity before claiming them. Acts of extreme evil weaken the boundary between the entity's realm and the world it targets, creating openings through which the entity can reach and pull victims into its domain. The most effective way for the entity to get a foothold in a new world is for it to corrupt its inhabitants to the point that they commit great atrocities, as gruesome acts of violence weaken the veil between the entity's realm and the world being targeted. The first to be taken are usually those who committed the atrocities, the corrupted ones who will become killers in the entity's service. Through the weak spots created by their violence, the entity's realm begins seeping over into the world, allowing the entity to pull its first victims into its own nightmarish construct. Once the killers are claimed, the entity can begin pulling in ordinary people, survivors who stumbled into the corrupted areas and were pulled through with no memory of how it happened. This process has been repeating across countless worlds for what the observer believes to be an impossibly long time. The entity travels from Terra World to Terra World, he records, growing stronger in its power until it eventually consumes all worlds in the cosmos. If this assessment is accurate, then the entity represents not merely a local threat, but a universal one, a force that will eventually devour everything that exists if left unchecked. The rich presence of auric particles and cells throughout the entity's realm indicates that it is far more ancient than even the observer and his people ever suspected, leading to his speculation that the entity is an original one, an ancient that existed at the dawn of everything. Whether anything can be done to stop this consumption remains one of the great unanswered questions of the lore, a mystery that those trapped within the entity's realm have little hope of solving while they struggle simply to survive the next trial. The origins of the entity remain shrouded in a darkness that even the most dedicated researchers have failed to penetrate. The observer, despite his unique position within the entity's realm and his access to memories spanning countless ages, has been able to establish only that this being is ancient beyond reckoning. His speculation that the entity is one of the original ones suggests something that existed at or near the beginning of existence itself, a primordial force that predates the worlds it now hunts. What caused such a being to develop its hunger for emotion? What drove it to begin its endless consumption of realities? No surviving record reveals. The observer's position is unique among those who dwell within the entity's realm. According to Arcus 08, he ended up in the entity's domain for 3 key reasons that set him apart from other victims. He had an interest in celestials, which ultimately led him to discover the entity in the first place. He witnessed the destruction of an entire world, which prompted him to discover more about this cosmic titan that could accomplish such devastation. And he went against the council, which ultimately led to his banishment within the very thing he had tried to destroy. His imprisonment was not accidental, but rather a consequence of his attempts to resist or understand the entity, suggesting that the cosmic horror takes note of those who seek to comprehend it and deals with them accordingly. The observer appears to be held prisoner in a mysterious tower located somewhere in the entity's realm, a structure that exists outside the normal flow of trials while remaining firmly within the entity's domain. In Arcus 02, he mentions that he was not the first to have been imprisoned in this tower, and most of the previous occupants have left journals and noted down their observations, which the observer now peruses for insight into his predicament and his captor. His device, the Orus, allows him to probe the black fog and find memories and stories within its realms, giving him access to knowledge that would otherwise remain hidden from all but the entity itself. This device appears to be key to his survival and his ability to document what transpires throughout the entity's domain without directly participating in the trials that consume most of those trapped within. The Orus is described as a spinning metal eye that slightly hovers, an artifact of unclear origin that grants its wielder the ability to see into the memories preserved within the fog. Whether all observers rely on such devices, or whether this particular observer created or discovered his Orus, remains unclear from the available lore. The rich presence of auric particles and cells throughout the entity's realm, the observer notes, indicates that the entity is far more ancient than his people ever suspected. These particles represent the fundamental building blocks from which the entity constructs everything within its domain, the very substance of which, its nightmarish architecture, is formed. If the observer's analysis is correct, then the entity has been accumulating these particles for eons, harvesting them from the worlds it has consumed and using them to expand its realm ever further. The scale implied by this assessment is staggering when considered carefully. When we contemplate that each world the entity touches might contain billions of sentient beings, each capable of generating the emotional sustenance it craves, the total amount of suffering the entity has orchestrated throughout its existence becomes almost impossible to calculate. The countless trials that have occurred, the numberless sacrifices that have fed its hunger, the untold souls that have been worn down to nothing and discarded into the void, all of this represents merely a portion of the entity's activities across its unimaginably long existence. The observer himself, who witnessed the entity consume his own world and everything he knew, has struggled to convey the full horror of what he experienced. It corrupts its victims, he writes, slowly driving them towards madness and eventually pushing them over the edge, which allows it to snatch them from their world and trap them in its realm. This corruption is not merely psychological but seems to operate on some deeper level, altering the fundamental nature of those it touches in ways that science as we understand it cannot explain. The entity can sense killing potential in individuals, a quality that marks certain people as suitable vessels for the darkness it wishes to unleash. This potential appears to manifest as something the entity can detect across dimensional boundaries, allowing it to identify and cultivate those who might serve its purposes long before they are actually claimed. The corruption process can take time, with the entity slowly influencing its targets toward violence until they cross thresholds that make them suitable for recruitment. The nurse, Sally Smithson, was corrupted slowly by the entity to get her to commit the act of violence that would make her suitable for service, demonstrating how the entity can play the long game when cultivating its killers. The physical form of the entity, to the extent that such a concept applies to something so alien, has been the subject of considerable speculation among those who study the lore. The spider-like appendages that emerge during trials and sacrifices have led many to conclude that the entity resembles a vast arachnid, though this may represent merely one of many forms it can assume, rather than its true appearance. The entity of Dead by Daylight appears to be something more fundamental than a single creature, not a monster, but an entire dimension devoted to the production of terror, a living space that contains all others within itself. The hypothesis that the entity possesses plant-like characteristics offers another perspective on its nature that does not necessarily contradict the arachnid imagery. This theory arose from observation of the Blight, a phenomenon that occurs periodically within the entity's realm and causes it to weaken significantly in ways that recall how plants suffer when infected by pathogens. During these episodes, cankerous growths appear on hooks and other structures throughout the trial grounds, while strange flowers called pustulas bloom in places they had never been seen before. Blight is a condition typically associated with plants affected by pathogenic organisms, suggesting that the entity might be vulnerable to infection or disease in ways that more conventional organisms are not. If the entity is indeed plant-like at its core, this would make it unique among the cosmic horrors of fiction, a predatory organism that grows and spreads like a vine across the cosmos, putting down roots in each world it touches and drawing sustenance from the suffering of those trapped within its branches. The observer has offered additional descriptions that complicate rather than clarify our understanding of what the entity truly is. His reference to the entity as a cosmic blood pudding suggests something formless and vital, a mass of essential substance that sustains itself through consumption. His characterization of it as a serpent of chaos evokes different imagery entirely, something sinuous and ancient that moves through the cosmic order, spreading disorder in its wake. Both descriptions may be accurate in their own ways, capturing different aspects of a being too complex for any single metaphor to contain fully. The entity may appear differently depending on who is observing it and under what circumstances, presenting aspects of itself that reflect the psychology of the observer, rather than revealing any objective truth about its nature. What seems certain is that the entity does not think as humans think. It does not see or monitor in the way we understand those concepts. It operates according to principles that remain opaque to human understanding, pursuing goals that may have nothing to do with the values or concerns that motivate mortal beings. This alien quality makes the entity particularly terrifying because it means that no appeal to reason or mercy can be expected to sway it from its course. It wants what it wants, and what it wants is the endless production of intense emotion, the suffering of countless souls feeding its insatiable hunger forever. Anything that generates emotional intensity feeds the entity, and the entity uses what lies within its own world to extend its power outside, creating holes in the real world to gather new victims, using the energy gained to spread its influence ever further across the cosmos. The entity's relationship with time adds another layer of complexity to understanding its nature and operations. Within its realm, time does not function as it does in the worlds from which its victims are drawn. Characters from vastly different historical periods find themselves trapped together. From the plague, who hailed from the Babylonian era thousands of years before the Common Era, to survivors taken from the modern day, or even from futures yet to come. This temporal fluidity allows the entity to draw victims from any point in a world's history, selecting those who best serve its purposes regardless of when they lived. The Huntress was taken from the forests of World War I era Europe. The Deathslinger hailed from the American West of the 1800s. Modern survivors like those from the Hawkins National Laboratory exist alongside these historical figures without apparent paradox. The entity can preserve its champions in time, keeping them ageless and functional regardless of how many years or centuries have passed in the worlds they came from. It also means that the torture and torment inflicted upon those within the realm can continue for what feels like eternity, since the normal progression of time that would bring relief through death or decay simply does not apply within the entity's domain. Some survivors have existed within the entity's domain for what feels like countless lifetimes, dying and being reborn at the campfire in an endless cycle that erodes their very souls while their bodies remain perpetually functional. The entity's power to preserve life indefinitely, even while subjecting its victims to repeated death, demonstrates a mastery over existence itself that suggests capabilities far beyond what any mortal science could achieve. Time within the realm seems to exist in a temporal lock, preserving everyone and everything in states that serve the entity's purposes, while preventing the natural processes of aging and decay that would otherwise end the usefulness of its captives. This preservation is not a gift, but another form of imprisonment, ensuring that souls cannot escape through the natural release of death, but must continue serving the entity's hunger until they are worn down to nothing and discarded. The fog serves as both the entity's medium and its mask, a manifestation that permeates every corner of its realm while concealing the true nature of what lies beneath. Those who have studied it most closely, researchers like Vigo and the Observer, describe it as something alive in its own right, a conscious presence that responds to thought and will, even as it serves the entity's greater purposes. The Observer notes that the fog feels alive when moves through it, containing swirls and streams of memories and imprints of beings from all the worlds the entity has consumed. This description suggests that the fog is not merely atmospheric decoration, but rather a repository of everything the entity has ever taken, a vast archive of suffering and experience compressed into tangible form that surrounds and permeates every corner of its domain. Those with sufficient knowledge and will can probe this archive, discovering memories and stories that would otherwise be lost forever, though such knowledge comes with its own dangers and costs. The dark mist that features throughout the trial grounds appears to be a lesser variant of the black fog surrounding the realm pockets, one of the entity's many manifestations that adds a sense of uncertainty to the environment where trials take place. For survivors, the fog creates both opportunity and danger. It provides cover in which to hide from pursuing killers, moments of concealment that might mean the difference between escape and capture. But it also hides dangers, obscuring the approach of predators who move through it with supernatural familiarity. The ambivalent nature of the fog reflects the entity's design philosophy throughout its realm. Every potential advantage balanced by corresponding risk, every hope shadowed by equivalent terror. The thickness of the dark mist can be altered through offerings burned at the campfire, remnants that appeal to the entity and cause it to adjust the conditions of the trials according to the wishes of those who make such offerings. The black fog, also known as dark fog or auric fog, surrounds the pocket realms of the entity and is but one of its many manifestations. In Arcus 54, it is described as a conscious entity in and by itself, something that possesses awareness independent of the greater entity while still serving its purposes. This suggests a kind of distributed consciousness throughout the entity's realm, where even the environment possesses some form of awareness that contributes to the overall purpose of generating and harvesting emotional energy. The black fog is composed mostly of auric particles and cells, from which the entity forms everything inside its realms. These particles represent the fundamental building blocks of reality within the entity's domain, the raw material from which everything is constructed. Indications of this composition are found with the iridescent add-ons that killers can equip, all of which were formed from the fog itself and are imbued with its power. These crystalline objects grant supernatural capabilities to those who wield them, demonstrating how the fog's substance can be shaped into tools of terror that enhance the killer's already formidable abilities. Some of the entity's more knowledgeable victims, such as Vigo and the Observer, were aware of the metaphysical relationship between their thoughts and the world they lived in, and thus able to hone their skills and bend the fog's irrefragable rules to their own purposes. This allowed them to mold and shape the black fog according to their will, an ability that most survivors never develop, and that represents one of the few means of resistance available within the entity's realm. Vigo, in particular, became adept at manipulating the fog, creating offerings and items that continue to aid survivors even in his apparent absence from the trials. His understanding of the fog's nature represents one of the most significant achievements in the history of resistance to the entity, proof that its seemingly absolute power can be challenged by those with sufficient knowledge and determination. The items that bear Vigo's name, including various offerings and tools, demonstrate his mastery over the fog's substance and his desire to provide assistance to others trapped within the realm, even if he himself could no longer participate directly. The realms themselves demonstrate the entity's power to create, while simultaneously revealing its limitations. Each trial ground is fashioned from the memories of those the entity has claimed, typically reflecting locations significant to the killers who serve as its instruments of terror. The Macmillan estate recalls the mines where Evan Macmillan committed his first atrocities, the industrial complex where his father's madness found expression through him. The Crotus Asylum mirrors the institution where Sally Smithson worked before her transformation into the nurse. The sterile corridors where she witnessed suffering and eventually succumbed to it. Cold Wind Farm preserves the rural setting of Max Thompson's violent childhood, the fields and farmhouses where he was imprisoned and abused before becoming a killer himself. In each case, the entity has reached into the minds of its servants and pulled forth the places that shaped them, reconstructing these locations within the fog to serve as stages for its endless performances of horror. A realm is the themed location, fashioned from the memories of the entity's victims, mimicking a twisted version of the location they were abducted from in ways that evoke memory while never quite capturing reality accurately. It usually consists of multiple maps and dictates their shared theme, but is itself not a playable environment that characters can traverse directly. A map is the actual playable environment in which the trials take place, located within a realm and representing a specific portion of the larger themed area. Multiple maps within the same realm share assets, fog color, sky color, and color palette, but feature different unique landmark buildings based on each map's individual lore and the memories it reflects. The trial grounds come in a variety of sizes and consist of tiles that are placed semi-procedurally between different trials on the same map, ensuring that no two trials play out exactly the same way even when they occur in the same location. But these recreations are never perfect, and their imperfection reveals something important about the entity's nature. The observer notes that the entity builds a reflection of the real world in its construct to confuse its victims, but is unable to really understand the true nature of the world it touches. It tries to replicate as best it can, although it never quite gets it right. This imperfection manifests in numerous ways throughout the trial grounds. Architecture that should be familiar feels subtly wrong, twisted in ways that unsettle without immediately revealing themselves. Distances seem off, proportions distorted. The whole environment shaped by a consciousness that has studied human spaces without ever truly understanding what makes them feel like home. The result is what the observer describes as an ever-changing nightmarish fusion of familiar and strange elements, a landscape that mirrors reality while remaining fundamentally alien to it. This alienness serves the entity's purposes by maintaining a constant low-level unease among those who traverse the trial grounds, a sense that something is wrong that contributes to the emotional intensity the entity harvests. Anything beyond the border walls of the trial grounds or the woods and black fog found surrounding the campfire are just a facade to mask the boundaries of the pockets, illusions that suggest infinite space while containing survivors within carefully defined limits that serve the structure of the trials. The campfire where survivors gather between trials occupies a unique position within this architecture of horror. It exists outside the trial grounds proper, a small space of relative safety where those who have escaped or been released can rest before being pulled into the next ordeal. Here, survivors can interact with one another, share knowledge and strategies, even form bonds that provide some comfort against the endless terror that awaits them. The campfire seems to represent a deliberate choice by the entity, a place where hope can be nurtured between trials so that it can be crushed more effectively when the hunting begins anew. The warmth of the fire offers just enough respite to prevent complete despair, keeping survivors functional and emotionally productive for the entity's purposes. The campfire is where survivors end up after entering the fog, a gathering place in the woods where they rest between trials until a killer pursues them again, and the cycle continues without apparent end. Multiple campfires may exist throughout the entity's realm, each serving a different group of survivors who may never encounter one another directly. This would explain how the entity can maintain trials involving seemingly infinite combinations of characters, while ensuring that each survivor experiences the realm as an intimate horror tailored to their own psychology. The survivors are never shown to be more than 4 at the campfire at a time, suggesting that each campfire serves a specific group rather than functioning as a communal gathering place for all who have been taken. The structure of the realm, with its countless pocket dimensions separated by the impenetrable fog, allows the entity to run what might be thought of as a vast factory of fear, with each production line operating independently while contributing to the overall output of emotional sustenance. Each trial can be understood as a single production cycle, with survivors and killers serving as both workers and raw materials in the entity's endless harvest. Beyond the trial grounds and campfires lie other spaces that survivors rarely glimpse, sub-realms that serve purposes distinct from the regular trials. The observer resides in a tower somewhere within the realm, a place from which he can probe the fog with his device called the Orus, without directly participating in the trials that consume most captive souls. Vigo established a hidden laboratory where he conducted his research into the entity's nature, leaving behind journals that would later guide others in their own investigations into the cosmic horror that holds them. These subrealms suggest that the entity's domain is far more complex than the trial grounds alone would indicate, containing spaces and structures whose purposes remain unknown to most of those trapped within. Subrealms come in 2 varieties: different planes of existence, existing within the trial grounds themselves, such as the dream world, accessible to the nightmare, and affected survivors, or small realm pockets outside of the trial grounds entirely. There are at least 8 known subrealms mentioned in the lore, including the campfire, the dream world, the spirit world, the phase world, the ferial plane, the upside down, and, most terribly, the void, where the broken are discarded. The entity's ability to shape physical reality within its realm extends to the creatures and objects that populate it. Animals encountered in the trial grounds are described as fabrications rather than living beings, constructs formed from the fog to enhance the atmosphere of horror without actually possessing the life they simulate. The crows that startle and give away survivor positions, the rats that scurry through abandoned buildings, the various fauna that create the illusion of a living environment, all of these appear to be artificial creations rather than genuine organisms. One notable exception mentioned in the lore is the horse associated with the clown's realm, which is described as being real despite the artificial nature of most other fauna. This exception raises questions about the entity's relationship with genuine life, whether it prefers to create simulations or occasionally imports real creatures for purposes unknown. Perhaps the horse serves some specific purpose in the clown's psychology that required an authentic animal rather than a simulation. Or perhaps the entity simply found it more efficient to claim a real horse than to construct one from the fog. The generators scattered throughout the trial grounds represent another enigma, mechanical devices that serve as the survivor's means of escape, but whose presence raises obvious questions about the entity's motivations. Why would a being that feeds on suffering provide its victims with any means of escape at all? The answer appears to lie in the entity's understanding of emotional mechanics and its need for hope as well as despair. Without hope, there can be no true despair. Without the possibility of escape, survivors would quickly resign themselves to their fate, and resignation produces far less emotional sustenance than the cycle of hope and disappointment that the trials are designed to generate. The generators exist because the entity wants survivors to believe they might actually escape, to invest emotional energy in their efforts, so that the crushing of those hopes produces maximum yield when it occurs. This represents perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entity's design, that it gives hope, specifically so that hope can be destroyed. The trial grounds serve as the entity's primary mechanism for harvesting the emotional sustenance upon which it depends. Each trial represents a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to generate maximum fear, hope, despair, and rage from the participants. A performance in which 4 survivors attempt to escape while a single killer hunts them relentlessly. The rules governing these encounters appear arbitrary from the perspective of those trapped within them, but reveal careful purpose when examined more closely. 4 survivors face 1 killer, a ratio that ensures the survivors have enough numbers to feel hope while remaining vulnerable enough to feel genuine terror. The balance is precise, calibrated through what may have been extensive trial and error to produce optimal emotional output. 5 generators must be repaired to power the exit gates, a task that requires cooperation and time, forcing survivors to move throughout the trial grounds while exposing themselves to the killer's pursuit. The whole system is engineered to produce a specific emotional arc, the rising hope of progress, the terror of being chased, the despair of being caught, the brief elation of successful escape for those fortunate enough to achieve it. The hooks that dot each trial ground represent the entity's most direct intrusion into the proceedings. These are not merely tools for restraining captured survivors, but sacrificial altars through which the entity extracts its sustenance directly. When a killer impales a survivor upon a hook, a process begins that will end either in rescue or sacrifice. The survivor hangs in agony while the entity's spider-like legs slowly manifest around them, reaching toward the suspended victim with evident hunger. If rescue comes, the survivor may escape to continue the trial and potentially generate more emotional energy through further encounters. If time runs out, or if the survivor has been hooked too many times, the legs close around them and drag them upward into darkness, completing the sacrifice and feeding the entity directly. The hooks are used by the killer to progress their main objective of sacrificing the survivors to the entity. Each map spawns several hooks placed randomly throughout the environment, as well as a fixed set of basement hooks that are impervious to any form of damage and cannot be sabotaged by survivors seeking to limit the killer's options. This sacrifice appears to be the primary method by which the entity draws sustenance from the trials. The terror of hanging on a hook, the despair of watching the entity's claws close in, the fading hope as rescue fails to arrive, All of these emotions feed directly into the entity's hunger. But the entity also feeds on the hope of potential rescue, on the courage of survivors who risk themselves to save their companions, on the rage that drives killers to hunt, on the affection that sometimes develops between survivors who face horror together. Every strong emotion generated within the trial grounds serves the entity's purposes, which is why the system is designed to produce such emotions in abundance. The killers and survivors both feed the entity in equal measure, their hatred and fear forming two sides of the same nourishing coin. The most effective way for the entity to procure those emotions is through the never-ending trials, invoking hope in survivors towards an escape from the nightmarish construct and fueling the killer's bloodlust in anticipation of the sacrifice, a bizarre ritual through which entity extracts its sustenance, which it needs to magnify its power and sustain itself. The generators that survivors must repair represent a deliberate choice by the entity to introduce hope into what would otherwise be pure despair. Early in the entity's existence, before the current system of trials had been developed, there may have been different approaches to harvesting emotion that proved less effective than the current model. Toward the beginning of the entity's parasitic relationship with the real world, there may have been some trial and error in developing the format that would eventually become standard. The first killer may not have been a success and was promptly thrown into the void, suggesting that the entity experimented with different configurations before settling on the arrangement that produces optimal results. The generators and exit gates that characterize modern trials may have evolved through this process, refined iterations of earlier systems that proved less effective at generating sustained emotional output from the souls the entity harvested. The exit gates provide the promise of escape, but also the possibility of failure at the final moment, ensuring that emotional intensity remains high throughout the trial. When survivors have repaired enough generators to power the gates, they must still reach and open them before the killer can intercept them. This creates a final gauntlet of tension that produces particularly intense emotions: the surge of hope as the gate begins to open, the terror as the killer approaches, the triumph of successful escape, or the crushing despair of being caught at the threshold of freedom when salvation seemed assured. The entity has even built in a fail-safe for situations where survivors take too long to escape after powering the gates. The endgame collapse triggers a timer after the gates are powered, and any survivor who remains in the trial grounds when that timer expires is claimed by the entity regardless of their hook status. Massive spider legs erupt from the ground to impale those who failed to escape, a dramatic demonstration of the entity's power and its unwillingness to let any trial continue indefinitely. The hatch offers an alternative means of escape, appearing when only one survivor remains. This mechanism has been attributed in the lore to Vigo, who may have created it as part of his efforts to study and potentially escape the entity's realm. Though whether he actually designed the hatch or merely discovered its existence remains unclear from the available information. Its presence adds another layer of complexity to the entity's carefully balanced system. The hatch gives the final survivor hope even when the situation seems lost, ensuring that useful emotions continue to be generated until the very end of each trial. Killers can close the hatch to force the survivor toward the exit gates, creating one final desperate gamble that squeezes the last drops of hope and terror from the proceedings. The hatch spawns in a random location in the environment and becomes available under specific conditions, appearing when one fewer survivors remain than generators completed, and opening automatically when only one survivor is left alive. The campfire serves as the transition point between trials, the space where survivors awaken after escaping or being sacrificed. Here, the entity's control over time and death becomes most apparent. Survivors who died in the previous trial find themselves alive again at the campfire, their wounds healed, but something subtle taken from them in exchange. With each death and resurrection, a piece of the survivor's soul is lost, a gradual erosion that eventually leaves them empty husks, incapable of generating the emotions the entity requires. This process explains why the entity resurrects its victims rather than simply claiming new ones for each trial. Fresh survivors arrive with full reservoirs of emotional capacity, but the entity prefers to drain each soul gradually rather than consuming it all at once. The repeated cycle of hope and despair, survival and sacrifice, produces more sustenance over time than immediate destruction would provide, making the preservation of survivors economically advantageous for the entity despite the cost of maintaining them. Memory appears to play a complex role in this cycle of death and resurrection. Survivors that are mortally wounded and die during a trial, or shortly after escaping, will be revived by the entity, also wiping their memories clean in the process and relocating them back to the campfire. Without this mechanism, survivors would quickly become desensitized to horrors they had experienced countless times before, their emotional responses dulled by repetition into something too weak to provide adequate sustenance. The memory wipe preserves the intensity of fear, the authenticity of hope, the crushing weight of despair when that hope is destroyed. Some survivors appear to retain fragments of memory despite this process, suggesting that the entity's control is not absolute, or that certain individuals possess natural resistance to its manipulation. Benedict Baker's journals demonstrate a level of recall that exceeds what the standard model of memory wiping would predict, raising questions about whether certain individuals are somehow protected from the entity's interference, or whether the entity allows some memories to persist for reasons of its own that remain unclear. The killers who stalk the trial grounds represent some of the entity's most disturbing creations. Ordinary people transformed into instruments of terror through corruption, torture, or willing submission to the entity's purposes. The entity actively recruits its killers by sensing their killing potential in their mortal selves, before corrupting them into committing violent or evil acts that weaken the boundary between worlds. This potential manifests as something the entity can apparently perceive, a quality that marks certain individuals as suitable vessels for the darkness it wishes to unleash. Once identified, potential killers are subjected to the entity's corrupting influence, a process that pushes them toward acts of atrocity that weaken the boundary between their world and the entity's realm. The entity can sense killer potential, and this is why certain individuals are taken rather than others. The potential is described as being like a smell, something the entity can detect that marks someone as suitable for its purposes, long before they have actually committed the acts that will seal their fate. The case of Rin Yamaoka illustrates how this selection process works and how the entity can adjust its plans based on circumstances as they develop. The entity originally targeted her father, sensing in him the capacity for extreme violence that would make him a suitable servant. But during the events that would have claimed him, the entity changed its mind, recognizing in Rin herself a potential that exceeded her father's. It is possible for the entity to change its mind during the process of converting a human into a new killer and choose someone else instead, if it senses greater potential in them. When Mr. Yamaoka murdered his daughter in a brutal attack, the entity intervened at the moment of death, claiming Rin as the spirit, while discarding her father as insufficient for its purposes. The rage that burned in her final moments, the desire for vengeance that consumed her as life faded, these proved more valuable to the entity than anything her father could have offered. The corruption that creates killers varies in intensity, depending on the individual being transformed and their willingness to serve. Some killers come to the entity already possessing the darkness it requires, their souls already stained by evil beyond redemption. The shape needs no corruption because his capacity for evil is innate and absolute. a void where humanity should reside that has been empty since birth. Others embrace the opportunity to continue their predation across infinite trials, finding in the entity's realm a paradise tailored to their darkest desires. For these willing servants, the entity need only provide victims and stand aside while they do what they would have done anyway. Some killers are happy to sate their bloodlust through the endless trials, requiring no coercion whatsoever to participate in the entity's harvest. Other killers require more persuasion, and the entity has proven endlessly patient in obtaining their compliance. Many killers do not serve willingly when first claimed. Some have to be tortured over endless years to be coerced into doing what the entity wants, subjected to suffering that would destroy ordinary minds, but that the entity's power preserves in full awareness and agony. The entity is ever patient, and the torture ever more severe, until the desired result is achieved. Eventually, they all cave in and start the hunt for the entity, their resistance broken by pain beyond description. The trapper, Evan Macmillan, initially refused to participate in the entity's hunts despite the atrocities he had committed in life. The entity's response was torture of a kind that mortal minds struggle to comprehend, extended across a time frame that the realm's disconnection from normal time makes effectively eternal. The heavy scarring across the trapper's body, the hooks driven through his flesh, bear witness to his resistance and the entity's patience in breaking it. Trapper was tortured to become a killer, and his visible injuries serve as testimony to what he endured before finally surrendering to the entity's will. The physical alterations visible on many killers serve as a rough guide to how much coercion was necessary to secure their service. The degree of torture needed to convince initially unwilling killers to do the entity's bidding can generally be gauged from any physical alterations visible on their bodies, such as the trapper's numerous iron hooks piercing through his upper torso, or the Blight's complete physical transformation into something no longer recognizably human. Those who arrived willing show little external change, their bodies preserved much as they were when claimed. Those who resisted bear the marks of their torture prominently, scars and wounds and deformities that testify to what they endured before finally surrendering. The nurse, Sally Smithson, displays the deterioration of a mind pushed past its limits, her appearance reflecting the psychological destruction she experienced. The plague, Adiris, shows the ravages of the disease that killed her, and the additional corruption the entity inflicted before she agreed to serve. Her body, a testament to both mortal illness and cosmic manipulation. The powers granted to killers upon entering the entity's realm demonstrate another aspect of the entity's control over its servants. Each killer possesses abilities that exceed what they could have achieved in their mortal lives, supernatural enhancements that make them more effective hunters within the trial grounds. The Wraith can render himself invisible, cloaking his presence until the moment he strikes. The Nurse can blink through solid matter, pursuing survivors through barriers that should have blocked her path. The Huntress can throw hatchets with impossible accuracy, finding her targets across distances that would challenge any ordinary human. These powers serve the entity's purposes by making the trials more terrifying for survivors, while also binding the killers more closely to their role as servants. The abilities are gifts, but they come with the unspoken understanding that they exist only as long as the killer continues to serve the entity's will faithfully. Some killers brought powers of their own when they arrived, entities already possessing supernatural abilities that predated their recruitment into the entity's service. The Nightmare's dominion over dreams, the Onryo's ghostly manifestation, the Cenobite's command of chains and hooks. These capabilities existed before the entity claimed them and continue to function within its realm. For such powerful beings, the entity employs a different method of control to ensure their obedience. the mark of negation is placed onto killers that would otherwise be too powerful to be controlled by the entity, as it sometimes pulls other powerful entities into its realm who might otherwise resist or even challenge its authority. The mark is a black symbol with a red glow that represents the spider-like claws of the entity placed on the killer's back just below their neck. This mark presumably limits their abilities in some fashion, ensuring that they remain useful instruments rather than potential rivals to the entity's dominion over its realm. The relationship between killers and the entity appears to be infinite in a way that the relationship with survivors is not, suggesting different roles within the entity's economy of suffering. The entity has a more infinite relationship with killers than with survivors, who are eventually worn down and discarded. Killers do not seem to be drained and discarded the way survivors eventually are, suggesting that their emotional contribution to the entity's sustenance operates differently. The rage and bloodlust that killers experience during trials may regenerate between hunts, providing a renewable resource that the entity can tap indefinitely. Alternatively, the entity may simply have more patience with its killers, recognizing that breaking and training new ones requires significant effort that could be avoided by maintaining its existing stable of servants in perpetuity. Killers can die in the entity's realm, but they are apparently restored to continue their service without suffering the cumulative soul loss that eventually destroys survivors. Killers who do not want to participate are willed by the entity by force, coerced through whatever means necessary until they comply with its demands. Killers appear to be kept isolated from one another between trials, each residing in their own space within the realm that reflects their personal history and psychology. This isolation serves multiple purposes within the entity's design. It prevents killers from coordinating against the entity, ensuring that each remains focused on their individual role rather than forming alliances that might threaten the established order. It ensures that each trial features a single hunter rather than multiple predators, maintaining the balance that produces optimal emotional output from survivors. And it maintains the psychological conditions that keep each killer focused on their appointed task, preserving their rage and bloodlust for the trials rather than allowing it to dissipate through social interaction. The exception to this rule came during the hallowed Blight, when the character who would become the Blight was able to access the areas where individual killers were kept and perform experiments upon them. This required special knowledge gained from Vigo's journal and the effects of the pustula serum, suggesting that normal movement between killer domains is impossible without extraordinary means that few possess. The survivors who populate the entity's realm represent its primary source of sustenance. Ordinary people, drawn from countless worlds into an existence of endless horror. Unlike killers, who were selected for their potential for violence, survivors appear to arrive through various means that suggest less deliberate targeting in most cases. Many simply wandered into corrupted areas, places where the boundary between their world and the entity's realm had been weakened by atrocity, and found themselves pulled through with no memory of how the transition occurred. Others were taken at moments of extreme crisis, claimed by the entity just before death would have removed them from its reach forever. Still others appear to have sought out the entity deliberately, like Benedict Baker, who researched the phenomenon for years before finally achieving his goal of entering the realm and discovering that escape was far harder than entry. The survivors who awaken at the campfire share certain characteristics regardless of their origins, common traits that define their experience within the entity's realm. They are all described as being at least 21 years of age, suggesting that the entity either prefers mature victims or that the nature of the corruption that allows it to claim people tends to affect adults rather than children. They possess skills and knowledge that prove useful in the trials. abilities to repair generators, heal wounds, evade pursuit, and support one another that may have been present in their mortal lives or may have developed in response to the pressures of their new existence. They retain their essential personalities, their courage or cowardice, their kindness or selfishness, though these qualities are tested and often transformed by the endless trauma they experience. The campfire serves as a gathering place where survivors can interact between trials, sharing knowledge and forming bonds that provide some comfort against the horrors they face. It is here that the teachable perks mentioned in gameplay find their in-universe explanation as survivors share the skills they have developed with others who might benefit from them. Meg teaches others how to run faster and longer, drawing on her background as an athlete. Claudette demonstrates healing techniques developed through her studies. Jake shows how to move through the environment without disturbing crows or leaving other traces. These exchanges represent one of the few positive aspects of existence within the entity's realm. Moments of genuine connection between people who share an impossible situation. But even these connections serve the entity's purposes in ways that survivors may not fully appreciate. Affection between survivors generates emotional sustenance just as fear and despair do. The entity feeds on strong emotions of all kinds, and the bonds that form at the campfire provide another source of nourishment. When a survivor watches someone they care about being sacrificed, their grief adds to the entity's harvest. When they risk their own safety to rescue a friend from a hook, their hope and terror combine in particularly potent ways that produce premium sustenance. The entity may have designed the campfire specifically to encourage such connections, knowing that relationships between survivors would ultimately enhance rather than diminish its feeding. The warmth and safety of the campfire, the opportunity to rest and recover between trials, all of this creates conditions where bonds can form that will later be exploited for emotional yield. The resurrection that survivors experience after each trial represents both mercy and cruelty intertwined, a paradox at the heart of the entity's realm. Survivors who die or are sacrificed do not remain dead, but awaken at the campfire ready to face another ordeal. This ensures that the entity can continue harvesting emotions from the same individuals indefinitely, extracting value from each soul far beyond what a single death would provide. But the resurrection comes with a cost that accumulates over time and eventually destroys those who endure it. Each death claims a piece of the survivor's soul, a gradual erosion that eventually leaves them empty shells incapable of generating the emotions the entity requires. This process explains the fundamental horror of the survivor's situation. They cannot die permanently, but neither can they escape. They are trapped in an eternal cycle of terror and relief, hope and despair, each iteration wearing away at their essential humanity until nothing remains but a husk. The memory wiping that occurs with each resurrection serves to preserve the intensity of the emotional experience. Survivors who remembered every trial they had ever endured would eventually become desensitized, their fear dulled by repetition, their hope extinguished by the certain knowledge that escape leads only back to the campfire and another trial. The entity prevents this by erasing memories of previous ordeals, ensuring that each trial feels fresh and each emotion retains its full intensity. Some survivors appear to retain fragments of memory despite this process, suggesting that the entity's control is imperfect or that certain individuals possess natural resistance. Benedict Baker's detailed journals demonstrate a level of recall that exceeds what would be expected if memory wiping were completely effective, raising questions about whether his deliberate entry into the realm somehow protected him or whether the entity allows certain individuals to remember for reasons of its own. The question of whether survivors can ever truly escape the entity's realm remains one of the lore's most tantalizing mysteries. The trials themselves offer escape through the exit gates and hatch, but this escape leads only back to the campfire rather than to the survivors' original worlds. The one character most strongly associated with potential true escape is Vigo, who appears to have found a way out through his research into the pustula flowers and the entity's periodic blight. Whether Vigo actually escaped or merely found a way to exist within the realm without participating in trials remains unclear from the available lore. Beyond the trial grounds and the campfire lies a place that represents a fate worse than the endless cycle of death and resurrection. The void is where the entity discards those who have lost all usefulness, survivors whose hope has been completely extinguished, and killers who have lost their drive to hunt. This subrealm appears to exist as a kind of cosmic junkyard, a dumping ground for the broken and the depleted who no longer serve any purpose in the entity's economy of suffering. When a survivor loses all hope, or a killer loses their drive to hunt, they cease to be of use to the entity, and that is where the void comes in. The void serves as a junkyard of sorts, filled with those that have been entirely drained of emotion and stripped of any value to the entity. The developers have described the void as a desolate realm of emptiness and decay, a place where the discarded exist without purpose or possibility. Those who dwell there are sometimes called haunts, echoes of the people they once were, now stripped of everything that made them individuals. Little is known about what existence in the void actually entails, whether the haunts possess any awareness of their situation, or whether they have been reduced to something more fundamental than consciousness. What seems clear is that being sent to the void represents the final termination of a soul's usefulness to the entity, the point at which even the memory of what someone once was becomes worthless. The existence of the void raises disturbing questions about the ultimate fate of everyone trapped within the entity's realm. Every survivor, no matter how strong their will or how fierce their hope, will eventually be worn down to nothing by the endless trials. Every killer, no matter how eager their bloodlust or how complete their submission, will presumably reach a point where they no longer serve the entity's purposes. The void awaits them all, a final destination that makes the endless cycle of the trials seem almost preferable. At least in the trials, there is terror, there is hope, there is something to feel. The void offers only emptiness, the complete cessation of everything that makes existence meaningful. The connection between hope and the void reveals the true horror of the entity's design. Survivors are kept alive and capable of feeling precisely so that the entity can continue harvesting their emotions. But this means that survival depends on maintaining hope, on continuing to believe that escape might be possible even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The moment a survivor gives up completely, the moment their hope finally dies, they become useless to the entity and are discarded. This creates a terrible paradox in which survivors must cling to false hope in order to avoid a fate worse than endless death, must believe in possibilities they have no reason to trust in order to maintain their utility to their captor. The fact that survivors can be worn down to the point of hopelessness despite the memory wiping suggests that something cumulative occurs across the cycle of trials, some essential depletion that the entity's manipulations cannot fully reverse. The soul loss that accompanies each death may represent this accumulating damage, a gradual erosion of the essential self that continues regardless of what the conscious mind remembers or forgets. The void may also serve as a destination for killers who fail to meet the entity's standards or who manage to resist their programming long enough to become more trouble than they are worth. The first killer recruited by the entity may have been a failure, promptly thrown into the void when they proved unsuitable for the role. This implies that the entity evaluates performance and makes decisions about which killers to retain and which to discard. There are aspects of the entity's realm that merit additional consideration, details that illuminate the nature of this cosmic horror. from angles not yet fully explored. The phenomenon known as bleeds or overlaps represents one such detail, areas where the boundary between the entity's realm and the real world has become permeable in ways that affect those who have not been formally claimed. These bleeds have been increasing in size and number, suggesting that the entity's influence continues to grow even as we speak of it. The locations where bleeds occur tend to correlate with places where killers were taken, such as Crotus Pen Asylum, where the nurse committed her final acts of violence before being claimed. The exact contents of these bleeds varies considerably from instance to instance, ranging from sightings of killers like the Oni appearing briefly to attack victims, to strange trees made of humans that leak purple liquid in defiance of all natural law. The blood web system that characters experience when developing their abilities represents another manifestation of the entity's presence within the realm. This web of interconnected nodes from which characters can draw power and items appears to be a direct connection to the entity itself, a means by which it distributes resources while also consuming something in return. The entity appears within the blood web after characters reach certain levels, competing with them for the available resources in what appears to be a deliberate game that mirrors the larger dynamic of the trials. Everything connected to the blood web is, in some sense, part of the entity, another tentacle of its influence reaching into every aspect of existence within its domain. The offerings that can be burned at the campfire represent attempts to appeal to the entity, to influence the conditions of upcoming trials, through what amounts to prayer or sacrifice. That these offerings work suggests that the entity responds to such appeals, adjusting reality according to the wishes of those who make appropriate offerings. This responsiveness might seem to suggest a form of benevolence, but it more likely represents another mechanism for generating emotional investment that can later be harvested. By allowing survivors and killers to feel that their actions can influence their fate, the entity creates additional hope and despair around the outcomes of those actions. The perks that characters develop represent knowledge and abilities accumulated through experience within the realm, survival strategies that have proven effective enough to be worth teaching to others. The teachable nature of these perks, the way they can be shared between characters, suggests a kind of oral tradition developing among the trapped souls, a culture of survival being built in response to the entity's predations. This culture exists because the entity allows it to exist, because the knowledge sharing serves its purposes in some fashion, whether by making trials more interesting or by providing another avenue for emotional investment that can be exploited. The totems scattered throughout the trial grounds offer another window into the entity's nature and the forces that operate within its realm. These bone constructions appear to serve as focal points for hexes that affect the conditions of trials, magical effects that grant killers additional advantages in their hunts. The existence of such magic within the realm suggests that the entity's domain operates according to rules that include supernatural forces beyond even its own direct control, forces that can be channeled and directed by those with the knowledge to do so. The cleansing of totems by survivors represents a form of resistance against these forces, a way to diminish the advantages that killers would otherwise enjoy. The killer powers themselves reveal something about how the entity views its servants and the role they play within its design. Each power is unique to the killer who wields it, tailored to their psychology and history, in ways that suggest the entity understands its servants on deep levels. The trapper's bear traps reflect his history with the mines, the implements of labor and death that defined his existence. The Wraith spell connects to the moment of revelation when Filippo Jomo discovered the true nature of his work. The nurse's ability to blink through reality echoes the dissociation from normal existence that characterized her mental decline. Each power represents a transformation of something personal into something deadly, the entity taking the raw material of each killer's history and forging it into a weapon. The survivor items similarly reflect the nature of those who use them. Tools that serve practical purposes while also connecting to the skills and backgrounds of individual characters. Toolboxes aid in the repair of generators. Medkits allow for healing. Flashlights can blind killers and create opportunities for escape. Maps reveal the locations of important objects within the trial grounds. Each item represents a form of resistance, a way that survivors can fight back against the entity's design even as they remain trapped within it. That the entity allows these items to exist suggests either that it cannot prevent them, or that their presence serves its purposes in some fashion, perhaps by increasing the hope survivors feel, and thus the despair when that hope is crushed. The add-ons that modify both killer powers and survivor items represent refinements of these basic tools, enhancements that increase their effectiveness in specific ways. The iridescent add-ons are particularly notable. Crystalline objects formed from the fog itself and imbued with its power. These represent the entity's substance shaped into functional objects, proof that the material of the realm can be harnessed by those who understand how to work with it. The hierarchy of add-on rarity, from common to ultra-rare, suggests a kind of economy operating within the realm, a system of scarcity and value that affects the choices available to those who participate in the trials. The archive system through which much of the lore is delivered represents the observer's efforts to document and share what he has learned about the entity's realm. The memories he discovers through the Aris form the basis for the stories told about each character, their histories before being claimed, and their experiences within the entity's domain. The observer appears motivated by a desire to understand and ultimately to escape, though his imprisonment within the tower suggests that the entity has placed limits on what he can accomplish. His willingness to share what he learns with others indicates either genuine altruism or a belief that widespread knowledge might somehow weaken the entity's hold on its victims. The rift system that allows players to unlock rewards by completing challenges represents, in lore terms, a mechanism through which the entity encourages specific behaviors and rewards those who comply with its design. Each rift follows a theme and tells stories related to that theme, expanding the lore in ways that connect to new characters and events within the realm. The entity's willingness to reward those who participate actively in its systems suggests either that such participation generates more sustenance than passive existence would, or that the entity finds amusement in the spectacle of those who embrace the roles assigned to them. The characters themselves, both killers and survivors, represent the entity's greatest achievement and its most significant vulnerability. Without victims, the entity cannot feed. Without killers, it cannot conduct its trials. The entire system depends on a constant supply of souls willing or forced to participate. A supply that the entity maintains through its network of cults and corrupted areas, but that, theoretically, could be disrupted. If the Imperiati or some similar organization were to prevent the entity from claiming new victims, the existing population of the realm would eventually be depleted through soul erosion, potentially starving the entity of the sustenance it requires. This vulnerability explains why the entity maintains connections to so many worlds simultaneously, why it cultivates worshippers and creates bleeds, why it continues its endless expansion across the cosmos. It must feed, and to feed it must claim, and to claim it must corrupt. Break any link in this chain, and the entity might be weakened in ways that create opportunities for resistance. The Blight's backstory demonstrates that escape from the void is possible under certain extraordinary circumstances. Talbot Grimes was cast into the void after losing all hope during his time as a survivor, but he managed to find his way back through the power of the pustula flowers that bloom during the entity's periodic blight. This suggests that the void, despite its apparent finality, is not completely inescapable for those with the knowledge and determination to seek a way out. However, Talbot's escape came at a terrible cost. His transformation into the Blight, a killer stripped of his humanity and enslaved to the entity's will. This may represent the entity's response to those who attempt to leave the void without permission, a punishment that turns escapees into servants rather than allowing them true freedom. The entity's power, vast as it appears to be, is not absolute. Within its realm, certain individuals have found ways to resist its control, to understand its nature, and, in at least one case, to possibly escape entirely. These figures represent the closest thing to hope that exists within the entity's domain, proof that the cosmic horror at the center of Dead by Daylight can be studied, understood, and, perhaps, eventually overcome. Vigo stands as the most prominent example of successful resistance, a scientist who entered the entity's realm and devoted himself to understanding its nature. His background in science allowed him to approach the entity analytically rather than simply enduring its horrors, and his research produced numerous insights that continue to benefit survivors even in his apparent absence. Vigo discovered that the entity undergoes a periodic purge, during which it is infested with blight, a condition that causes cankerous growths and strange flowers called pustulas to appear throughout the realm. These pustulas produce a putrid nectar that, when properly processed, grants abilities that can be used to resist or manipulate the entity's control. Vigo's journal details his findings about the blight and the serum that can be derived from pustula nectar, though crucial pages describing the serum's effects and preparation were torn out, possibly by Vigo himself to prevent others from using his work improperly. The implication in the lore is that Vigo used this serum to escape the entity's realm entirely, making him possibly the only individual ever to achieve true freedom from its grasp. Whether this escape succeeded or whether Vigo met some other fate remains unconfirmed, but the artifacts he left behind continue to influence events within the realm. Vigo's shroud, one of the offerings that can be used in trials, is described with his words noting that he found marvels through the years in the fog, but only now understands how to bend the fog's irrefragable rules. This suggests that Vigo achieved a level of understanding and control over the entity's realm that no one else has matched. The hatch that appears in trials as a final means of escape has been attributed to Vigo's invention, though this remains unconfirmed. If Vigo did create the hatch, it represents an extraordinary achievement: the installation of a permanent feature within the entity's carefully controlled trial grounds that provides survivors with hope beyond what the entity intended. The observer represents a different kind of resistance, one based on isolation and observation rather than direct action. Imprisoned within a tower somewhere in the entity's realm, the observer uses a device called the Orus to probe the black fog and discover memories and stories hidden within it. This allows him to learn about events throughout the realm without participating in them directly, accumulating knowledge that might eventually prove useful for escape or resistance. The observer appears to have been a member of a people who witnessed the entity consume their homeworld, an experience that gave him unique insight into the entity's nature and methods. His imprisonment within the tower may represent a kind of containment, the entity recognizing his potential threat and choosing to isolate him rather than allowing him to move freely within the realm. The tower places him beyond the reach of the trials while keeping him within the entity's domain, a compromise that benefits both parties in different ways. The observer's writings, collected in the Arcus entries that form a major component of the game's lore, provide much of what we know about the entity's origins and methods. his description of the entity as one of the original ones, his speculation about its hypothesized plant-like biology, his account of how it corrupts worlds before consuming them, all come from his observations and analysis. The observer may be the closest thing to an expert on the entity that exists within the realm, though even his knowledge remains fragmentary and speculative in many areas. Talbot Grimes, who would eventually become the Blight, represents a more tragic form of resistance. Like Vigo, he discovered the pustula flowers and recognized their potential, finding Vigo's hidden laboratory and using the journal within to guide his own research. Talbot became obsessed with creating a serum from the pustula nectar that would allow him to escape the realm, conducting experiments on captured killers to test various formulations, but the serum proved addictive, clouding his mind and corrupting his body, even as it granted him powers beyond normal human limits. Talbot eventually injected himself with the serum in a desperate attempt at escape and underwent a transformation that stripped away his humanity, becoming the Blight, a feral creature enslaved to the entity's will. His story serves as a warning about the dangers of trying to use the entity's own power against it, suggesting that even successful resistance may come at costs that make victory indistinguishable from defeat. The knowledge that Vigo may have escaped and that others have found ways to resist the entity's control offers a glimmer of hope to those trapped within the realm. The entity is not omnipotent, not omniscient, not immune to exploitation by those clever and determined enough to seek its weaknesses. The Blight represents a genuine vulnerability, a periodic weakening that someone with the right knowledge might exploit. The fog can be bent by those who understand its rules. The void can be escaped by those with the will and the means to find their way back. None of these facts offer easy answers or guaranteed freedom, but they suggest that the entity's dominion, however vast and terrible, is not completely beyond challenge. The entity's influence extends beyond its own realm into the worlds from which it draws its victims. Cults devoted to its worship exist across multiple realities, groups of people who have learned of the entity's existence and chosen to serve it in exchange for power, knowledge, or simply the thrill of connection to something cosmic and terrible. The most prominent of these is the Black Veil, an organization that has appeared in numerous lore entries under various names and forms. The Black Veil operates as a secret society composed of powerful and wealthy individuals capable of controlling governments and major institutions. Its members wear long black hooded robes and pursue goals that align with the entity's purposes, performing human sacrifices, arcane rituals, and cruel experiments designed to weaken the boundary between worlds and provide the entity with new victims. The Black Serpent Society represents another manifestation of entity worship, one that envisions the entity as a massive serpent made of dark mist with 9 heads and 9 tails. This society believed that within the entity, which they called the Belly, lay lost knowledge and power from all the consumed worlds that could help humanity achieve a golden age. Their worship involves sacrifices and rituals intended to please the serpent and gain access to the wisdom it had accumulated through eons of consumption. Whether the Black Serpent Society and the Black Veil represent the same organization under different names or distinct groups that developed similar beliefs independently remains unclear from the available lore. The existence of these cults suggests that the entity actively cultivates worshippers in the worlds it targets, using them as agents to prepare the way for its eventual consumption. The cults perform atrocities that weaken dimensional boundaries, identify individuals who might serve as killers or survivors, and spread the entity's influence throughout their societies. Some cult members apparently aspire to become killers themselves, viewing service to the entity as a form of ascension rather than damnation. Others may hope to gain supernatural powers or forbidden knowledge through their devotion, though whether the entity actually rewards its worshippers or simply uses them remains unclear. The Black Veil has played a direct role in the stories of numerous characters within the Dead by Daylight universe. The twins, Charlotte and Victor de Chaz, encountered the cult during their desperate existence in 17th century France. The artist, Carmina Mora, joined the Black Veil before discovering that they were selling art to corrupt officials and becoming disillusioned with their methods. Hattie Carr's story involves conflict with cult members who sought to use her for their purposes. The cult represents a constant presence, threatening characters across different times and realities, a terrestrial extension of the entity's cosmic malevolence. The Imperiati exist as a counterforce to the Black Veil, a group of people who have learned of the entity and dedicated themselves to fighting against its influence. Members of the Imperiati include the Richter family, parents of the survivor Felix Richter, and the Ricoto family, parents of the survivor Elodie Ricoto. The organization operates from a base on Dyer Island, working to stop the Black Veil's plans and find ways to protect their world from the entity's consumption. The existence of the Imperiati suggests that resistance to the entity is possible not only within its realm, but in the worlds it targets, that people can learn of the cosmic threat and organize to oppose it. Whether the Imperiati have achieved any significant victories against the entity or its cults remains unclear from the available lore. The entity's relationship with its cults reveals something important about its nature and limitations. Despite its vast power within its own realm, the entity apparently cannot simply reach into any world and claim victims at will. It requires the assistance of mortal agents to weaken dimensional boundaries, to perform the rituals that create openings through which it can extend its influence. This dependence on worship and atrocity suggests that the entity, for all its cosmic horror, operates according to rules that limit its freedom of action. Understanding these rules might provide the key to resisting or even defeating the entity. A possibility that characters like Vigo and the Observer have spent their existence within the realm trying to realize. The entity remains, after all that can be said about it, fundamentally unknown. The lore of Dead by Daylight offers glimpses and fragments, observations recorded by survivors and researchers who have experienced only portions of its reality. But the complete truth of what the entity is and what it ultimately wants remains beyond reach. This deliberate obscurity serves the horror at the heart of the game, the sense that no matter how much one learns about the entity, there will always be something more, something worse, lurking just beyond comprehension. What we know with certainty is relatively limited. The entity is ancient, possibly one of the original ones that existed at the dawn of reality. It feeds on intense emotion, sustaining itself through an elaborate system of trials designed to generate maximum psychological extremity. It travels between worlds, consuming them gradually through a process of corruption and harvesting that may eventually claim everything that exists. It can be weakened during the periodic blight, but has never been defeated or destroyed. It maintains its realm through rules that, while incomprehensible to human minds, appear to be consistent enough that individuals like Vigo have learned to exploit them. What remains unknown is far vaster. We do not know where the entity came from or what caused it to become what it is. We do not know whether it possesses consciousness in any sense recognizable to humans or operates according to instincts more fundamental than thought. We do not know whether its consumption of worlds serves some ultimate purpose or represents simply an endless hunger with no goal beyond its own satisfaction. We do not know whether the entity can be killed, whether some weapon or force exists that might destroy it, or whether it will continue its consumption until nothing remains but itself and the void. The silence on these questions is itself significant. The developers have clearly chosen to leave certain mysteries unresolved, recognizing that horror often depends on what is not known rather than what is. An entity whose nature and vulnerabilities were fully cataloged would be less terrifying than one that remains perpetually beyond understanding. The lore provides enough information to create a sense of terrible reality, while leaving enough gaps for imagination to fill with fears worse than any explicit description could provide. For those trapped within the entity's realm, these mysteries offer both torment and hope. The uncertainty about whether true escape is possible keeps survivors fighting through trial after trial, clinging to the possibility that they might find the key to freedom that Vigo apparently discovered. The uncertainty about the entity's limitations keeps researchers like the Observer probing the fog for insights that might prove useful against their captor. Even the uncertainty about ultimate fate, about what lies beyond the void for those who are finally discarded, provides a kind of comfort compared to certain knowledge of endless emptiness. The entity endures, patient and hungry, while worlds continue to fall into its grasp and souls continue to feed its impossible appetite. Perhaps someday someone will discover its weakness and bring about its destruction. Perhaps the Imperiati or some other group of resistors will find a way to protect their world from its consumption. Perhaps Vigo's escape represents the first step toward a larger liberation that will eventually free everyone trapped within the nightmare realm. Or perhaps the entity will continue forever, growing stronger with each world it consumes, each soul it harvests, each emotion it feeds upon, until nothing exists except the endless dark of its dominion and the fading screams of those caught within it. The entity's presence can be felt in every aspect of the realm it has created, from the darkest corners of the trial grounds to the seemingly safe warmth of the campfire. It watches without seeing, knows without understanding, consumes without satisfaction. Its hunger is eternal, its patience infinite, its reach extending across dimensions and through time itself. Those who have studied it most carefully agree on at least one thing. The entity is growing stronger. Each soul claimed, each world touched, each cult that spreads its influence adds to its power in ways that may eventually make it unstoppable. The bleeds are growing more frequent and more severe. The Black Veil expands its reach into new spheres of influence. Somewhere in the darkness between worlds, the entity continues its endless feast. And somewhere in the light of the campfire, survivors continue to hope that escape might somehow be possible. The question that haunts everyone who learns of the entity's existence is simple but unanswerable. With certainty, can it be stopped? The evidence suggests both possibilities simultaneously. Vigo may have escaped, proving that the entity's grasp is not absolute. The Blight weakens it, periodically suggesting vulnerability to attack or exploitation. The Imperiati fight against it in the real world, demonstrating that resistance is possible. But against these hopeful signs stand the entity's vast age, its cosmic scale, its apparently inexhaustible patience in pursuing its goals. It has consumed worlds before. It will consume more. Whether anything can ultimately prevent it from consuming everything remains the greatest mystery of all. The archives continue to grow, and we who listen must attend to what they reveal. If this journey into the darkness has found you well, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with others who might benefit from these explorations. There is always more to discover in the spaces between worlds. more records to examine, more whispers to hear from those who have passed through places we can only imagine. Until we meet again among the archives, may your own passage through the fog be swift, and may whatever light guides you prove more trustworthy than the campfire's glow.